Between 1938 and 1945, the Mauthausen Concentration Camp was part of a network of concentration camps that stretched across the entire German Reich and, later on, also across parts of the occupied territories. The high wall in front of you separated the part where the inmates were held, the prisoners' camp, from other areas. Construction of the Mauthausen Concentration Camp began in August 1938, just a few months after the annexation of Austria to National Socialist Germany. The first prisoners were transferred from Dachau concentration camp. At first, the camp consisted of only wooden barracks and an electric fence. The imposing stone buildings and enclosure wall were not built until later. Today, only a few parts of the former prisoners' camp still exist. There also used to be barracks around where the visitor center is now located. Prisoners were usually transported to Mauthausen in large groups and by train, often in freight trains or cattle trucks. The field with trees you see today was, at the time of the camp, a site of mass death. This was the site of the so-called Sanitätslager, the infirmary camp. It was originally established in 1941 as a camp for Soviet prisoners of war. It consisted of several wooden barracks surrounded by an electric fence. By the time it was finished in summer 1943, the majority of the Soviet prisoners of war were already dead. Therefore, the camp was used to accommodate sick prisoners who were no longer able to work. The granite quarries in Mauthausen and Gusen were the reason that the SS established concentration camps in these places. In order to run and exploit the quarries for economic gain, it had founded its own company, the Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke GmbH, or German Earth and Stoneworks Company. The firm profited from the back-breaking labor of the concentration camp prisoners and produced enormous profits. The Mauthausen quarry, together with the one in the Gusen branch camp 4 kilometers away, soon formed a giant industrial complex. The quarry was also a site of extermination. The so-called stone-carrying work detachment, also known as the Strafkompanie, the penal company, was forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilos up the quarry steps to the camp. They were therefore called the Stairs of Death by the inmates. Prisoners were also deliberately killed here. They were shot or pushed to their deaths over the edge of the quarry. For the latter, the SS used the cynical term parachutist. When the concentration camp memorial complex was established in 1949, only remnants of the original camp still remained. From the 1950s onwards, the nations to which the victims of the concentration camp had belonged started to erect their own memorials. Today, the memorial park that grew up in the following decades is a mirror on the politics of the post-war era and the Cold War. Some of the states represented here, such as the Soviet Union, the GDR, and Yugoslavia, no longer exist. Others, for example Ukraine, were new and wanted to see themselves represented retrospectively. The memorials are often national, heroic and masculine in character. Consequently, all those prisoners who did not fit this image were excluded for a long time. Deported civilians, those persecuted on racist grounds, homosexuals, and also women. A memorial to Jewish victims was only erected in the 1970s, and one to Roma and Sinti only in the 1990s. This was the main office of the former camp administration. It is the only SS building remaining today. By the end of the war, nearly 8,000 men were involved in guarding the main camp and subcamps. For the high-ranking SS officers, a separate residential estate was built not far from the camp where they lived with their families. There were lots of different types of contact between the resident population and members of the SS, such as economic relations, joint festivities and marriages, but also pub brawls and other forms of conflict. For the 7 years of its existence, only 2 commandants worked at the Mauthausen concentration camp. The camp gatehouse was the only entrance to the prisoners' camp. Consequently, it was strictly guarded and controlled. Newly arrived inmates entered the prisoners' camp for the first time through this gate. This was followed by a lengthy admission procedure that was always accompanied by torture and harassment. The prisoners were forced to line up along the camp wall. They were often left standing there for several hours, regardless of the burning summer sun or winter frosts. Many died of exhaustion or from beatings by the Kapos or SS. In camp jargon, this section of the wall was given the name Wailing Wall. The roll call area was the focal point of the prisoners' camp. Roll call took place 2 or 3 times a day on the roll call area. For the SS, the roll call was also a way to display the power they held over the prisoners. The inmates had to stand to attention in perfect rows, in all weathers, regardless of rain, snow, or sun. The right-hand side of Barrack 1 housed the camp clerk's office. In the center of the barrack was the canteen. Here, as a productivity incentive, the prisoner, functionaries and other privileged inmates could purchase goods such as tobacco, personal hygiene articles and, very occasionally, additional foodstuffs. The left-hand side of the barrack was the prisoner brothel from 1942 onwards. A visit to the brothel was only granted to a very few privileged prisoners. Each barrack in the prisoners' camp was intended for 300 prisoners, but during the second half of the war, some barracks were being used to house up to 2,000 people. They were divided into 2 rooms, A and B, each of which was divided into a sleeping area and a common room. The latter was reserved for the small number of prisoner functionaries. As a rule, 2 or sometimes more prisoners had to share one bed on the wooden bunks. Often, sheets and straw sacks were only provided for the prisoner functionaries. Everyone else usually had little more than an old woolen blanket. Daily life in the camp was shaped in equal measure by frenzied activity and monotony. From 1941 to 1944, prisoners categorized as Jews were housed in Room B of Barrack 5. They were isolated from all other prisoners and were at the very bottom of the camp hierarchy. They received fewer rations, poorer clothing and no form of protection from the cold in the winter. They were also denied any medical treatment. Jewish prisoners were assigned to particularly arduous work detachments. Under these conditions, most died just a few days or weeks after their arrival. Others were deliberately murdered. The barbed wire fence to the north of the camp is a reconstruction dating from 1947. Beyond the fence, a memorial stone and a cross mark what is known as the ash dump. This was the site of a rubbish tip that, from 1944, was also used for the ashes of prisoners' corpses burned in the crematorium ovens. In the final months before liberation, some 45,000 prisoners of the Mauthausen Concentration Camp and its subcamps died. When the US Army liberated the camp, they found hundreds of unburied corpses. The American liberators created cemeteries to bury these dead. Many prisoners also still died after liberation of disease and exhaustion. They were also buried in the new cemeteries. In the decades after the end of the war, the use of these cemeteries was discontinued. The mortal remains of the prisoners were exhumed in order to identify them. Some were transferred to their native countries. Others were reinterred in newly created cemeteries in the quarantine camp and in Camp 2. Today, these cemeteries are the final resting place of over 14,000 people who died in the concentration camp. This yard, an area separated from the rest of the camp by a stone wall, where barracks 16 to 20 were located, was always used to isolate particular groups of prisoners. For a long time, it was the site of what was known as quarantine. With 1,000 or more prisoners being held in them, the barracks of the quarantine camp were usually completely overcrowded, with neither beds nor blankets. The hostile prison conditions led to a large number of deaths among the prisoners crowded together here. From the beginning of 1945, barracks 16 to 18 were no longer used as a quarantine camp. Following the arrival of just under 2,000 women and children from the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp, the SS designated these barracks a so-called women's camp. Block 20 was considered a death block. In 1944 and 1945, prisoners of war were interned here under horrific conditions. Seeing that their situation was hopeless, around 500 prisoners from Block 20 staged an escape attempt. Over 400 were able to escape. They were hunted, searched out, and usually killed on sight by the SS, the police, and the local population. The event came to be known cynically as the Mühlviertler Hasenjagd, the Mühlviertel hare hunt. This area, surrounded by a stone wall, where the mortal remains of nearly 3,000 prisoners who died after liberation are now buried, was created in 1941. Initially there were workshops here, and from 1944 onwards it was used as a quarantine area. During this period, the prisoners arriving by mass transport had to spend their first weeks here under harsh conditions. This part of the camp, known as Camp 2, became a center of organized prisoner resistance in the months before liberation. Beyond this wall lay what was known as Camp 3, an extension of the original prisoners' camp. During the final months of the war, it became a site of mass death, systematic mass murder, but also of resistance. At the end of 1944, this brick building, the so-called New Infirmary, was finished, and parts of it came into use. It was like a small hospital, but the seriously ill and prisoners unable to work, if they were not a member of a privileged prisoner group, were considered useless. The former infirmary has served as a museum building since 1970, having undergone major structural alterations. On the ground floor you can visit the permanent exhibition, The History of Mauthausen Concentration Camp 1938 to 1945, and in the basement the exhibition The Crime Scenes of Mauthausen, Searching for Traces. The killing area and the crematoria are located in the following basement rooms. Whilst at first the dead were burned in the municipal crematoria in Steyr and Linz, in 1940 the camp's first incinerator went into operation. A second oven was added in 1942 and a third in 1945, shortly before liberation. These crematoria were used by the SS not only to dispose of the corpses, but also to eliminate the traces of violence and neglect visible on those corpses. Separate prisoner work detachments were responsible for burning the corpses. They were housed in this basement, isolated from the rest of the camp. Starting in 1941, facilities for mass killing were installed here. An execution room with an apparatus for shooting people in the back of the neck, and a gallows. In early 1942, the SS began to operate a gas chamber. Up to May 1945, at least 3,500 prisoners were killed in it, using the poison gas Zyklon B. After 1945, none of the SS men accused of committing crimes in the Mauthausen concentration camp ever tried to deny the existence of the gas chamber at Mauthausen or the murder of people in it. The camp prison, known as the bunker, was completed in 1940. It consisted of 33 cells. Detention, often made more severe by imprisonment in a blackout cell combined with withdrawal of rations, was one of the official punishments the camp commandant was entitled to impose. Often he did this arbitrarily. Punishment was handed out for the violation of any number of regulations and prohibitions, some of which were unknown to the prisoners and which often contradicted one another. The bunker was also used to house prisoners who had been transferred to Mauthausen for execution. Some were shot in the camp prison courtyard, others murdered in the gas chamber or execution room. Interrogations carried out by the SS and Gestapo in the bunker always went hand in hand with torture and severe mistreatment. While the camp was in existence, a Reichsadler or imperial eagle stood resplendent over the gateway to the SS garage courtyard. On May 5, 1945, the day of the liberation of the Mauthausen Concentration Camp, it was torn down by a group of prisoners. In doing so, they were getting rid of a clear and visible symbol of the National Socialist reign of terror. In the final days before the liberation of the camp, chaos prevailed. The death toll was huge. The SS tried to obliterate the traces of its crimes. It had evidence destroyed and witnesses murdered. On the morning of May 3, 1945, the prisoners lined up for their last roll call. Afterwards, the SS handed over guard of the camp to a fire brigade unit from Vienna and left. Between August 1938 and May 1945, around 190,000 prisoners were deported to Mauthausen. At least 90,000 died in the main camp or one of its subcamps. Many continued to die in the weeks and months after liberation as a result of concentration camp imprisonment. Only a few of those responsible were brought to account in court in the years and decades after the end of the war.